Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Anne Olnick-Gumowitz, the Engelson Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Joan Gans Cooney and Peter G. Peterson Fund, the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, Sally Menard and Norton Garfinkel, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.
I'm Alexander Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. The end of history? Nearly a quarter century ago, author Francis Fukuyama naively predicted Western liberal democracy would mark the universal endpoint of our political system. Instead, terrorism was born, regimes clenched to theocracy, and so-called liberal democracies, our own included, effectively converted to plutocracies or oligarchies, enduring a decades-long backlash against the people they purported to serve. Our guest today is on the front lines of democratic reform. Annika Savill is the executive head of the United Nations Democracy Fund, supporting projects that strengthen the voice of civil society, human rights, and pluralism in the transition and consolidation phases of democratization. We've now veered away from the false view of democracy as a panacea, a magic bullet to resolve the ills of civilization. For in reality, the absence of strongmen has unleashed tremendous mayhem, including the present refugee crisis. So let me ask Annika how this contemporary climate is impacting her vision for the future of democracy. And welcome.
Thank you, Alexander, and thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. My vision is complicated because the challenges are many and multifaceted. If we start with what you were alluding to, which I suppose is most related to the Arab Spring, I've just come back from a tour of the region that took me almost a month. I went to 3 key countries, some of which are maybe not talked about so much. I went to Algeria, Tunisia, and Turkey, near the Turkey-Syria border. 2 of those 3 countries are not directly impacted by the refugee crisis, but Tunisia is very much impacted by the Arab Spring because that's where it all began 4.5 years ago. Tunisia remains until now the only successful example of the Arab Spring, and whoever you may talk to in the democracy support community will be in agreement on that one point. However, Tunisia now faces challenges that have to do with a stagnating economy, that have to do with an export of jihadism. They are the world's leading export of extremist fighters to ISIS, not only per capita, but in absolute numbers. Those problems have their roots in the same issue that generated the Arab Spring, namely unemployment among young people with university diplomas. Those people are those who veer towards extremism. Those are the people who now need to be given a sense of participation in their society, a sense of economic empowerment, but also a feeling that they are not powerless. So I want to stress that Tunisia, again, this is something that everybody will agree upon in the democracy support community, deserves and needs all the support that it can get from funders outside and from practitioners. When I went to the Turkey-Syria border, I saw the most, how can I put this, tangible evidence of how communities are coping once they leave Syria, once they flee both the government and ISIS. And what I did there was visit a project that I have with Syrian refugees living in a town on the border on the Turkey side. This project shows what we can do through empowering refugees to participate in their community and to organize themselves. And I wanted to talk a bit about that if I can.
Please.
This project works primarily with Syrian women who have families, who did qualified jobs back in Syria. They were engineers, they were architects, they were pharmacists. You've heard this before. Syrian refugees tend to be highly educated, highly skilled people. Since they started living in Turkey, they will usually keep the family economy going by cleaning hotel rooms, or maybe teaching in an Arabic language school that the refugees have set up for themselves. But what my project with them does is allow them, for the rest of the day, after they finished cleaning the hotel rooms, to start their own projects in empowering their community, such that they're educated in how to organize themselves, how to do media, how to do budget, and then invited to propose whatever project they think is important for a community. So now one of them wants to start a legal clinic. She was a lawyer back home in Aleppo. A legal clinic for Syrians who have no identity papers in Turkey. Another wants to start a women's committee to inform the Syrian community in Turkey about what their opportunities are. Another wants to start a vocational program for young girls, because families are increasingly tempted to sell their 14-year-old daughters to early marriage to earn some money. A vocational program to teach them a trade. All these projects should not just, they all deserve and they will get support, I hope, from my fund for a long time, but they also need to cross-pollinate, and that's why we want to start a house where all these projects interact with synergy and can also become a community center for not just women but men and children to congregate and organize themselves. And I hope that that can also become a model for other Syrian communities, not just in Turkey, not just in the Middle East, but also in Europe. A house for projects of Syrian refugees. And I mentioned this as an example of what we can do in terms of democracy with a small d to integrate and empower this vast movement of people that is happening now. And I think we have an opportunity as much as a challenge. So that opportunity is called civil society. It doesn't require the state to do what I just described. And I think that is the beauty. And if you listen to, for example, the Secretary General's advisor on migration, he will say that empowering and supporting civil society to integrate and empower these refugees is just as important as government support.
Thank you. Thank you for describing your mission with such specificity. I think our viewers will really appreciate that. At the same time, I want to ask you, what has been the obstacle as far as the Turkish government is concerned in empowering the women?
I wouldn't want to review the performance of the Turkish government vis-à-vis refugees, because it's generally understood that all the frontline states in this crisis, of which Turkey is one, Lebanon, Jordan, the others, need much more support from Europe, the United States, to deal with this crisis. What I can say about our project specifically is that apart from understandable paperwork, there has been no obstacle to us getting permission from the government of Turkey to operate this project, and I'm grateful for that.
We were discussing earlier about differentiating between rights and democracy, and I thought you had some provocative and informed words on the subject, because the way that you're describing Syria as it operated pre-Civil War. It may not have been a democracy, but there were rights that were granted to people who are now marginalized and homeless. As I alluded to in the opening, there may be a totalitarian clamp, but in all honesty, how are these refugees greeting the idea of democracy?
When we talk about rights and democracy, we have to remember that democracy is, to all intents and purposes, an ideology. Human rights are a set of legal instruments, both internationally and nationally. And so there are countries that may allow people to own land, for example. That's a right, but may not be a democracy. Or they may allow women to drive a car, but they may not be what we call a democracy, just to take some very down-to-earth examples. They may, in other words, allow for freedoms, but not freedom as we understand it here in the United States. The refugees, I think, are interested in freedoms primarily at this stage, and I think they're interested in economic empowerment to build a future. But those refugees that reach and are lucky enough to root themselves in Europe, for example, will of course, no doubt, as have generations of people from the Middle East before them, embrace that. I don't know, for example, if you know that in Sweden, 2% of the country is Iraqi and 1% of the country is Iranian already. Sweden is now also the biggest, after Germany, recipient of refugees from Syria. That integration has gone well on the embracing and adjustment to democracy. And I have no doubt that it will be in this case too.
What has proved the most successful strategy for economic empowerment among young people in steering them away from jihadism?
Small entrepreneurship, I would say. I met a most stimulating young man who has in Tunisia a lot of plans and ideas for this. There has been in the Middle East some successful models of inviting young unemployed people to run a small business, whether it be in manufacturing or in agriculture. In the beginning, it may start with, and this is run then with microfinance, where they are given a certain amount upfront and not required to pay it back until it starts to pay off. In the beginning, it may start with an activity that is suggested by the microfinance entity, but after a time, they will generate their own ideas, and that's when you really start to see people being motivated to build a future themselves. But I keep coming back to this, that we can run all the democracy projects that we want in terms of educating people and how to be a good citizen and civic engagement and how to vote. But if we don't have that ingredient of economic empowerment, we will not get there. So I think the two have to be married much more in the future.
What were some of the obstacles to creating a form of self-government that would enable that kind of empowerment? Was it in part putting a framework together legally for this to be accepted, so that if you start a business, it doesn't matter what color your skin is or how old you are, if you have an idea, you can apply that entrepreneurship and employ people?
For so long, Tunisia was run top-down in all aspects of life. And that included the economy at the same time. The previous government, the one that was ousted by the Arab Spring, had quite simply a policy of distributing too many college diplomas, generating false hopes in order to basically buy support from the population. Here is a college diploma, you support me, without considering the fact that when you build hopes like that, you have to give them a reason to keep going. When you dash those hopes, you create a lot of frustration and animosity that takes its expressions in many ways, in the Arab Spring, or in jihadism, or in general frustration. And at the same time, what we have as a problem in Tunisia now is a stagnant economy for many other reasons.
We can talk about pockets in which you are involved, and that stretches every continent, right? But the obstacles to a rights-based economy include...
The obstacles to a rights-based economy include, I think, most specifically the authoritarianism that is reemerging in most of the transitional states now, i.e. in the former Soviet Union, in parts of Africa, in parts of Latin America. You have a resurgence of a sense of authoritarianism, even in countries that were moving towards being established democracies. There is among the economic powerhouses, there is a wish to assert control rather than delegate it. It could be that countries that are new to being empowered need to go through that phase before they feel secure and confident enough to empower the people. But now, today, it's all about the BRICS and the mints. I'll spell those countries out if you want, but it's the rise of these. It's the rise of these very successful countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria. Help me out here. They are now, I think, held up more as the model that other countries want to follow than those countries who are grappling with how to really consolidate democracy and to see the rise of a strong civil society. That's not interesting for many countries in development right now.
Annika, I thought, without getting into a game of rating democracies on their efficacy or their progress, which I promised you we wouldn't do here, and I had no intention of doing, I am interested in contrasting Saudi Arabia with Iran insofar as theocracy in those countries is playing out differently, and I don't know if you have any projects actively in either country, but if you could tell us about any projects you do and how you try to draw the bridge from theocracy, not necessarily to democracy, but to, again, a kind of society that respects pluralism.
Well, I should start by saying that the fund that I had supports civil society projects, that is, non-state actors, in very specific endeavors that they generate. I.e., they propose to us a project that they have in mind, and we may or may not select that for funding. We have not worked in Saudi Arabia. I'll leave it at that. And in Iran, we may have a project coming up. It may be possible to implement. I don't want to comment on it, but I'm hopeful. There are many, many talented people there with creative ideas on participatory approaches. There is a strong civil society there. They may not be focused right now on political activities, but the main thing to start is that they have a tradition of participatory approaches and generating ways for civic participation in how a society is run, and that can be done in a variety of ways, not necessarily political or challenging the nature of the government of the day.
You have the distinction, Annika, of working with both the present Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and his predecessor, Kofi Annan. I wondered if you saw an evolution, not in terms of their personal leadership styles, which I don't want you to comment on, but on the direction democratic empowerment has gone. I wonder, as the UN recently convened all of its delegates, what is the mandate that you see yourself entrusted with in achieving civil society for all those victims of the refugee crisis?
Well, I think when it comes to the United Nations, we have to look at the context in which it finds itself at any given time. So when Kofi Annan was in power, that covered the period before and immediately after, for example, the US intervention in Iraq. And I think it's possible for everybody to discern a difference in the attitude that people have towards democracy support before and after that event. It became far more controversial after the United States intervention in Iraq to work for democracy promotion, as it's called. And I think he had to contend with that. We should also remember, and it's said often, but it is the case, that the UN is an association of states. So it is really what member states can agree upon, not what the Secretary General wants to see happen, that will in the end of the day prevail. Mm-hmm. We should also remember that democracy is not a word that exists in the United Nations Charter. When the Charter was written 70 years ago this year, fewer than half of member states were democracies. Today it's somewhat over half, but some of those are democracies in name only. So democracy is not something that has programmatically existed explicitly in the work of the UN. Yes, we can talk about good governance, we can talk about political affairs, but until the creation of the Democracy Fund in 2005, there was no UN entity with that word in its name. Ban Ki-moon has, of course, inherited this set of challenges, but what he has been doing for the past 6 months or so, and we very much welcome this in our entity, is he's been very outspoken on the issue of the increasingly restrictive climate in more and more countries towards civil society, i.e. towards NGOs. This has become almost an epidemic, I could say. More and more countries every year are learning bad practices. Instead of good practices or best practices, it's the worst practices that are prevailing. Legislation has been introduced. 100 pieces of legislation in the past 3 years have been introduced restricting the rights of NGOs to operate in a number of countries, and a growing number, on every continent. Ban Ki-moon has made a number of very forceful statements about that, and I think that's both courageous and very important, particularly for those democracy activists who are subject to those restrictions.
Finally, Annika, I want to ask you about something I mentioned in the intro, the influence of money in governance, and how you apply this idea of self-government, democratic republicanism, in the context of an economy, when we're having a debate in this country about income inequality and the vast proportion of wealth that is in the hands of a microscopic few. When we're having that debate, is that democracy?
Yeah.
Is that plutocracy?
Yeah.
Is that oligarchy?
Yeah. So,
a fair question?
Totally fair question. Increasingly analyzed by the best minds in the democracy support scholarship business. The question is entirely legitimate, since the gap between rich and poor exists in virtually every country. Is it really enough to compensate that frustration with the right to vote every few years? You ask yourself, is that a democracy? I have no answer, but I can certainly agree with the worry. And if it prevails, then democracy itself will surely be undermined because it loses more and more of its value in the minds of the majority.
And are you going to consider projects that diversify economies so that wealth can be spread across society?
Well, I'm going to give the boring UN answer to that it's right now beyond my mandate, beyond the mandate of the UN Democracy Fund, but it's certainly something that the UN as a whole is grappling with in many parts of the organization. As regards the other part of the problem, money and politics itself, it is certainly a big problem that many in name-only democracies have a totally established system of patronage, clientelism, rent-seeking behavior, and so on, that does not deserve the name democracy. I would say in some continents, out of dozens of countries that are labeled democracies, maybe fewer than half a dozen are in effect democracies.
Well, I would welcome that reclassification, and I'm sure some of our viewers would too. So we very much appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful. Thank you, Alexander.
And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other interviews. And do check us out at Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming.
Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Anne Olnick Gumowitz, the Engelson Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Joan Gans CUNY and Peter G. Peterson Fund, the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, Sally Menard and Norton Garfinkel, with special thanks to the Schumann Media Center for additional support, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.